Everyone, I want to talk to you guys about something that could happen and could have some very destructive consequences. Not could. If it does happen, it will have very destructive consequences. I am talking about the possibility of 3 million refugees leaving Syria and heading towards Europe. I'm talking about a repeat of what happened in 2015, only worse. If this happens, it would be at a grander scale than what happened in 2015, and the political effects, the negative political effects, will be much worse. Lately, there has been some talk within Western governments about the possibility of another huge refugee crisis in Europe. Just a few days ago, there was a senior U.S. administration official who gave a talk at the Munich Security Conference. And in this conference, this U.S. official for the Trump administration said that if fighting continues in the Idlib province, you will have 3 million Syrians leaving their country. And they will cross the Turkish border. And they will try to get into Europe. And he said that Turkey does not have the capacity to hold in 3 million more refugees because Turkey already has 3.5 million refugees within its border. And so he says that if this fighting continues in Idlib, it's going to be disastrous. Already you have hundreds of thousands of Syrian fighters within Idlib. So you have that. And then you have millions of civilians who are trapped within the fighting. Let's not forget, you have Russian mercenaries in Idlib, Turkish soldiers in Idlib. You also have the whole problem with the Kurdish-Turkish fighting. You have the Russians fighting the US-backed rebels. You have the Russian-backed rebels as well. And you also have the Bashar al-Assad regime soldiers being backed by Russia, and they're fighting the US-backed rebels. It's a whole quagmire of mess. Trapped in the middle of all of this are the civilians, and they don't want to live, nobody wants to live, in the midst of gunfire and fighting. And then, I want to say just a couple of weeks ago, there was a German, I actually wrote about this, but there was a German official by the name of Gerald Knaus. And Gerald Knaus is a German official who specializes in the subject of immigration into Europe and the phenomena of refugees and migrants entering Europe and basically thinking of ways to mitigate the problems that arise alongside the phenomena of migration. And he said something very similar. He said that if the situation in the Middle East continues, you're going to have not only another refugee crisis, similar to what happened in 2015, but actually it would be tremendously worse than what happened in 2015. So you have an official from Germany and also an official from the United States essentially saying the same thing. And on top of that, you also have another situation that's currently taking place, and that is the horrendous situation happening in the Sahel region of Africa. We're talking Burkina Faso, Nigeria, those countries. Those are big oil countries, and where you have oil, you also have the propagation of violence. And Africa is full of oil mafia. There are a lot of armed and criminal gangs who live in these oil regions, and they actually get paid by the big oil moguls for protection and also so that they don't attack the people involved in drilling oil. It's kind of like what happens in Mexico, where narcos will actually kill employees for Mexico's oil company, and they would steal oil and make tons of money out of it. Africa is in a similar situation, but much worse, I think. And there has been a lot of massacres in that area of Africa especially in Nigeria and also in Burkina Faso. Just yesterday, there was a report about 24 people being massacred outside of a church in Burkina Faso. So it's like it's a pretty messed up situation. And what are you going to have with so much violence in Africa? You're going to have migration. Wherever you have violence, you're going to have migration. For some reason, a lot of people don't think about this stuff. They'll say, well, it's not our problem, who cares? But like, they can't register, or they can't really ponder deeply on the fact that where you have violence, you're going to have migration. And if you have Western countries dabbling into other countries, I'm not saying this is happening in Africa, although it is possible, because the French and the Germans, the Turks have made quite a presence, military presence in countries in Africa. Libya, Somalia, Congo, Central African Republic, those places. If you have this sort of dabbling and people are being armed and certain people are being pushed to commit violence, civilians are going to want to leave. I mean, in Nigeria, millions of people have been displaced over the years because of Boko Haram. Wherever you have war and violence, you have migration. The same thing happened in the American Civil War, where after the war, tons of people, hundreds of thousands of people, were leaving the southern states and migrating into the north. It's just natural. It's inevitable. So you have all this violence happening in the Middle East. Due to what? Due to NATO countries getting involved in the Middle East. The United States, France, Turkey. Russia is not in NATO, but Russia has been heavily involved, and they have also been doing they've also been doing a lot of political dabbling, and they've had a lot of political involvement in the Middle East. And you also have a lot of Russian mercenaries in Syria. You have the whole Wagner group. So you have all this violence taking place, and where you have violence, you have migration. It's just a simple fact. And so if you have another migrant crisis, what is there to expect? Well, it's very simple. More vicious nationalism. The effects of the 2015 refugee crisis were what? What were the political effects in Europe? European governments like Austria, Hungary, began to talk about strengthening their border security, right? So there was this huge emphasis on border security. There still is. The former head of the EU Commission, what was his name? Jean-Claude Juncker. He did a whole speech talking about how we have to get stronger border control, stronger border security. This whole tough on immigration stuff. It gets more intense, and even officials who would be considered liberals or progressive will jump on that boat and give off this perception that they are extremely strong and they're very, very forceful about immigration. And that is a sympathy, what the hell is wrong with me? That is a symptom, not a sympathy, that is a symptom of tribalism and nationalism. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have border security. And I hate that I have to keep repeating that. Like, I'm not saying we shouldn't have border security. Yeah, we should have border security. We should vet people, definitely. But my point is that when you have this rise in this rhetoric of border security, it's a symptom of tribalism. It's a symptom of the reality that people in the populace, they want that sort of thing, right? They want that sort of thing because nationalist sentiments are surging. They become very intense. And when you have that intensification of nationalist sentiment and tribalism, what is the end result? The end result is people start electing politicians who are either borderline Nazis or are Nazis. Like, they're Nazis. Like, they're it's like they're nationalistic enough that they please the nationalist vote, but they stop short of, calling for the deaths of certain people. But they'll say all sorts of Nazistic things. Like, you had that one guy from the AFD talking about how Africans and white people breed differently. What was his name? Bernd Hoke, I think. Hoke was his last name. You had Petrie. She used to be the head of the AFD. She talked about the coming Darwinian war between whites and Arabs. Like, you have that sort of thing getting more intense. And so the political effects of millions of more migrants trying to enter Europe will be extremely devastating, because then people are going to want to turn to nationalist parties that otherwise would be not even popular or would be considered on the fringe. These parties would become extremely popular. Just look at what happened with Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. He was a nobody. He didn't have a single seat in the Dutch parliament. Now he's like, what, the second or third largest party in the Netherlands. AFD, one of the biggest parties in Germany. You actually have, it's quite a fascinating phenomena, and it's a scary one at the same time, but you have actual Nazis in the German Bundestag. And they're not saying, Heil Hitler. They're not saying it in public. But if you look at their ideology, obsession with race, obsession with a race war, obsession with racial homogeneity, if you look at all of these facts, all of these aspects of them, it's quite obvious what their agenda is. But their popularity is a result of mass migration. And that's the danger. And it makes you wonder if that is one of the plans of the powers that be. It makes you wonder. But anyway, you guys just heard some theology. Hope you guys have learned